Hi, welcome. I'm happy to have my friend Jan Besaden-Note join us today, and my dog Bowser. We're at my home, and I asked her if she'd take a moment to talk with us today about her experiences. She did some wonderful things in hospice over the last many years, and is just a pleasure to have join me in classes. She has worked with me in classes on topics like death and dying prior. She has her master's in social work and has done a great deal in the helping in human service industries for many years in general. We joined with each other and met each other at the Centers for Spiritual Living through Mile High Church and some of those other related practices, and it's just been wonderful to get to know her. So,
Well, thanks, Vanessa. Glad to join you.
thank you. I'll let you start talking. If you just want to talk a little bit about your history, starting in childhood because of
Sure.
some of the experiences you've
Sure.
had up through present, that'd be great.
Absolutely. Well, I did work in hospice for virtually all of my career, and I'm so grateful, particularly to one individual for that and for the very rich experiences that I've had. When I was a little girl, I was blessed to have one grandfather who really took me under his wing. And my grandfather was a physician and a mystic, very, very much a mystic. And when I was a little girl, he allowed me to be present with him in his office practice, and I lived in New York City as a little girl, and we would spend hours and hours walking around the streets of New York City. And, completely unbeknownst to me at the time, he was really, teaching me some very key spiritual lessons from the Kabbalah, from the Sufi traditions, from the Zen traditions, and so I realized that I came into adulthood because of him, and I'll share a pivotal experience I had with him that really brought me into hospice, but really well equipped to do this sacred and beautiful work of being by the side of the dying during their time of preparing for transition and transition. So that work has been a blessing for me for almost 40 years, and I'm very grateful for that. When I was about 15 years old, my grandfather became quite ill. Perhaps doctors didn't quite have the awareness that they have these days about the dangers of smoking, or perhaps some people just choose not to attend to those warnings for whatever reason. Anyhow, my grandfather, Papa Sam, to me, was a 2 or 3 pack a day of Lucky Strike non-filters. And in 74, 75, he became quite ill and quite disabled from lung cancer, which metastasized and spread pretty quickly. And he was placed long-term, something else that wouldn't happen these days, in a hospital in New York City. And it was not too far from where I went to school, so I would go to school, and then every afternoon I would race over to the hospital as quickly as I could so I could spend some time with him. And back in those days, children visiting the hospital wasn't allowed, so I had to get a little bit ingenious about that. So I acquired a candy striper uniform. And I don't even know if there are candy stripers these days, are there?
I don't think so.
I'm dating myself badly.
That was a good position for teens, though.
It was a wonderful position. And so I would sort of tear down the street, rush into a restroom at the hospital, get this candy striper uniform on, and go up to be with my grandfather. And of course, all the nurses knew that I wasn't really there to be a candy striper. I was there to be with my grandpa. And we had a lot of very, very precious and insightful conversations about life and life beyond this life as he was dying. I remember so clearly the afternoon that he made his transition. I had a real strong feeling I should go quickly, and rushed from school and got up to his room, and the family was gathered around, and he was in traction. His spine had disintegrated, from the cancer. And they had holes drilled in his head, and so he was, sort of stretched out and a lot of discomfort. with tubes, feeding tube, IVs, et cetera, et cetera. And I climbed up into bed beside him, sort of wove my way around all these tubes and so on and so forth. And as he was taking his final breath, I said to him, Papa Sam, I'm going to do something in my lifetime about how people die, and my real thought and feeling based on all of those conversations that we had is that it was high time for people to be empowered to die on their own terms. Human life is finite. We knew that. We know that. We all know that. And we don't get to live in these bodies forever. But tragically, for so many people still to this day, we don't really truly choose how we're going to die. We don't get to choose who's with us when we die, how comfortable we want to be, how much medical intervention we do or don't have. We flip to fear, and we go very quickly into acquiescence, to just agreeing to whatever is offered to us, or grasping for the straws, if you will. So I was in high school at the time, went on to college and graduate school, and it was not too many years beyond that I started working formally in hospice, first as a volunteer and then a CNA as I was making my way through school, and as a social worker, and I had some spiritual training as well, and did some chaplaincy work, and ultimately in 1996, I think, with a few other people, another social worker, a nurse, and a physician, we founded a hospice called Namaste Hospice. And our purpose was to be truly present with people during their transition, and to make our services available to all, regardless of ability to pay. And we focused with some exclusivity, not complete, but we really intentionally focused on taking care of people who we consider to be from historically disenfranchised and stigmatized groups, including the homeless and the chronically mentally ill. And that was really our mission and purpose for about 16, 17 years. And then at that time, I sold the business for a variety of personal and professional reasons, and I have been retired for the most part, and doing some traveling and teaching and working with people in different cultures and countries, trying to make myself available for one-on-one death doula work to the extent I can.
Can you explain death doula work? Because that's probably a term that some people may not be familiar with.
Well, a lot of people are familiar, with the concept of a doula or a midwife assisting in the process of birthing, bringing a human from the womb into, into life as we typically define it. And, in hospice and palliative care, we see the birthing process and the deathing process as really being twins or mirrors of each other. And so a death doula, there are many roles and so forth, and I believe it's becoming a lot more formally defined. But when I started doing that work, it wasn't formally defined, and it was really just about a strong presence, just being very much present. And as one of my favorite teachers likes to say, and taught many generations of hospice folks to say, we're not leading or following, we're just walking beside. We're walking each other home, and that, of course, is Ram Dass. Yeah.
And I have to say now, because you mentioned Ram Dass's name, I think this is so neat, where Jan was able to spend some time on the phone talking through, was it connected to the death doula concept with Ram Dass, or what all did you?
To some extent. We were connected, through mutual friends and colleagues in the Dance of Universal Peace community, which is a community that actually my wonderful Papa Sam brought me to as a child. I remember, dancing with him in circle and zikrs and, the Sufi contemplative practice. for many years. But yes, I did have the opportunity to talk to Ram Dass and to Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and, other real leaders in this field. And, I had the opportunity to say to Ram Dass, I've been using your words for 30 years in my teaching of, nurses and social workers and chaplains and volunteers. And I love to remind people, as you reminded us, that we truly, really are all just walking each other home. It's not a situation of leading or following. We're walking each other home.
Thinking of, so a lot of these people are training to be therapists or counselors or social workers, that realm.
Wonderful.
What do you feel was the most, what are the takeaways as far as the things that were the most beneficial that you did, or that people that were in the dying process really found comfort in or support through?
Gee, that's that's a challenging question. I came to believe over many years of doing this work that what people really want is to be heard, to be acknowledged as the unique individual that they are. There are some experiences that I found to be fairly universal. Most people don't want to be alone. Most people have questions that are going through their minds. And sometimes they need to discuss the questions, sort of where did I come from, where am I going, those kinds of existential questions. And sometimes it's an internal process, a conversation they have with their creator, and other times it's something that they need to talk about with another human being. But I think that as I go back through, in my mind, through the years of doing this work, I've just been at thousands of bedsides. I stopped counting many years ago when I hit 1,500, which is a really big number.
That is a really big number.
Of opportunities to really just be present with someone as they're making that transition from life in this body to life differently, whatever that looks like. It's so individual. I don't think I ever did or said the same thing,
Right.
twice. And I think that if I could really get one message across to people who are coming into the sacred work, it would be really listen and observe and pay attention and ask people what it is that they want and need from you. And don't be afraid of silence. Don't feel like you need to do something all the time. Just your presence, your willingness to be there as a companion and a witness is enough. I think it's important, and in America we struggle with this concept. I think it's important to recognize that dying is not a medical event, it's a human event. And what can you, as a counselor, as a social worker, as a chaplain, a volunteer, what can you do? How can you behave to really acknowledge the essential humanity in this situation?
I wanted to circle back because I didn't remember that you had met Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. So how, in what context, or when did you cross paths?
Well, many years ago, everything, you reach a certain stage in life and everything feels like many years ago, and I'm at that stage in life, I have to say. In the early 1990s, I had an opportunity to go down and spend 2 weeks at hospice of the Florida Suncoast down in Clearwater, Florida. And they were just piloting a program that they had developed to certify hospice leaders to become hospice trainers. And I had the opportunity to be in, I believe, their first class, their sort of pilot program, and spent 2 weeks down there. And Elizabeth Kubler-Ross came to us to speak with our group, and we spent quite some time together, and were able to really dialogue in and outside of the classroom. And it was just insightful to get her experience. Yeah. And I also had the opportunity, back in the early days, I joke sometimes that I was in hospice for so long. It's like God was young and dinosaurs still roamed the earth back in those days. And it's a very different world in many ways now, as contrasted with, the 70s and 80s when the hospice movement was born in this country. But I also had the opportunity to travel to England, probably in the late 80s, to go to St. Christopher's Hospice and spend a few days with Cicely Saunders, who is the physician. She became Dame Cicely Saunders, and she really is credited as being the founding mother of the modern hospice movement. And that was fascinating.
That is.
Yeah.
I was thinking a bit about the energy in the room during the process and right as they've, stopped this life in terms of heart rate and brain function and all that.
That you can
measure. Can you talk about that in the room and before and after, and maybe kind of the exchange of energy, or what you were feeling, or what?
Well, I can try.
Yeah, and I'm sure that's highly individualized as well.
If there are, thousands of situations that I have had the opportunity to be a part of, there every situation had its subtle differences. And it depends on, who the person really was during their lifetime, what kind of family and friends they had around them or didn't have around them, what kind of unfinished business they had. But I can say, if I could generalize, which is a really hard thing to do, but if I could generalize, I would say that generally the atmosphere, at the time of transition is one of peace. It's one of great peace. Usually, not always, but usually there's been a large degree of acceptance. One of the things that's just fascinated me and countless other people about the deathing process is that across cultures, across traditions, across socioeconomic status, religion, what have you, there seem to be some pretty uniform experiences. The peaceful nature of it is one of those uniform experiences, but another one is a phenomenon that is often called celestializing. People talk about seeing the light and wanting to go to the light, and it's a little more complex than that. The actual descriptions are not just of light, but people also talk about seeing the images of people who have passed before them. They also talk about, often about transportation. I see a train going, I see a horse galloping off across the field, and so on and so forth. And typically the way I was trained and the way I trained others is, well, let's encourage them. Let's encourage them to go toward that light, to those people, to go hop on that horse and ride off into whatever is next, whatever lies beyond, life in this body and form. But that's a really interesting commonality, because I was saying across, a great deal of diversity, the description of that experience is so similar. And for me, in my own belief systems, I feel like that
it's the truth.
It doesn't necessarily say this is true, but it certainly, nudges me and others who have had that experience in a certain direction of knowing that, what we can perceive with our senses here in these human bodies is very limited.
Thinking about all of your processes with the thousands of people that you were with, what do you think you would want for yourself?
Oh gosh, well,
I'm throwing them at you. We didn't pre-plan this. I can answer it for myself if you need a moment to consider.
No, not really. I don't need a moment to consider it all. I'll use this for a moment of advertising, and so I'm going to tell you that from the last time I looked at the statistics, and I am semi-retired, so it hasn't been recent, but less than 5% of Americans really do have advance directives. They rarely have people taken the time to just be very thoughtful, prayerful, whatever it takes for them, and really write out what's most important to them. I have done that, and I also considered, again, very thoughtfully and prayerfully, who would be the best person to be my medical decision maker. And something I want to share, because a lot of folks don't even know that this is possible, is that the person who I chose is a very dear friend who happens to be a priest. And I do have 3 daughters and, grandchildren and so forth, but I didn't choose them to represent me in the event that I can't speak my own wishes, because my wishes, quite frankly, may be a little bit difficult for somebody who loves me a lot to implement. Because I'm very clear that I don't want medically delivered nutrition, hydration. I don't want to be kept alive unnecessarily. I really believe in letting go and letting God. I believe from decades of experience that people suffer far more from. I hate to even say this, but sometimes the interventions that they experience, to prolong the inevitable, cause far more pain and discomfort and damage.
And sometimes it's connected to that fear.
Than simply allowing. Yeah, the fear is interesting, isn't it, Vanessa? Because I think it's just very clear that human beings all around the world, it's not unique to this culture, but I think we have a tendency to be scared to death of death. We don't know what that is. We don't know what that looks like.
The unknown.
And so we really want to keep it at arm's length. And I'll just say again from personal experience, it doesn't look nearly as scary close up.
Yeah. I was thinking about just even developmentally where individuals tend to develop less and less fear the older they get, which obviously means you're moving closer to death as a general rule.
Generally,
yeah. And yet there's less fear associated. So I do think maybe the closer you get, often, right, the less fear there is.
Other lessons that I learned. I haven't. I wasn't as old as I am now for most of the time I was working in hospice. But I still learned so many valuable lessons for my life, wherever I was, in life. I learned to really take the time to identify what's personally important to me. I really learned as I was deep in the hospice world and in my career and founding a program and, being on boards and management and blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. I also had 3 young daughters at home. And so one of the things I knew, because I had conversation after conversation with dying people about what are your wishes? What are your regrets? What are you happy about? What are you sad about? What's it like to be you right now? And people always, nobody ever said, I wish I had made more money. I wish I, had a more important job. I wish I worked more hours. It was things like, I wish I followed my dreams. I wish I took the time to sit on the floor and play with my kids. I wish I got out in nature and just breathed more often. And so, I made sure to check myself to, go do those things and to really stay in gratitude no matter what.
My next question, but I feel like you answered it, was going to be kind of what did work with the dying teach you about living, I guess, but maybe a lot of that.
I think for me, perhaps I've answered it a bit, but I think, working with the dying taught me to live fully. That it really taught me that every day that I have in my body, with my family, with my friends, doing the things I love is truly a gift, and to cherish it. And it taught me a great deal, a lesson becoming clearer as I get older, but it taught me a great deal about impermanence and attachment, and I somehow know, and I think it's largely because of the work I did, to hold all things very lightly.
It's good wisdom. Any last thoughts for our students and those that are listening?
Well, I wish them all well, and I would encourage them, if they're choosing this line of work, to really enter it prayerfully and carefully, and really know that this is something that they're called to do, and to be willing and able to show up at the bedside of people who are dying with their whole selves, just entirely. I found that it's not helpful to, in fact, I've been humbled a few times when I've rushed into a situation with my clipboard and all my answers and stuff like that, and really found out how little I know. So,
thank you. We can do a namaste.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. Thank you again for joining us.